My name is Emily Max. I'm a researcher here, and I'm notably the organizer of the IHL Talks series. It's my pleasure and the Academy's pleasure to be here for this talk on the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. The panel was originally supposed to have also Verity Robson from the UK Permanent Mission, and she apologizes she cannot be here due to health reasons. But we nonetheless have a very exciting panel with us today, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I already do. I'll introduce everyone from left to right. So on my left, we have Jean-Marie Enkert, who's the head of the ICRC project on updating the commentaries to the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. And prior to that, he was involved in the project on customary international law. He has authored many books and articles on IHL, and he's here to talk about his current endeavor. To my right, we have Boyd van Dyke, who is a lecturer and historian of modern Europe and international legal order at the University of Amsterdam. He has done his PhD as a comparative study of the making of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and he's currently finalizing a monograph of the Geneva Conventions for Oxford University Press. So he's going to bring a historical and maybe critical perspective to the discussion. And then last but not least, we have Professor Marco Sassoli, who is the director of this very institution and also a professor of international humanitarian law here and teaches also at the University of Geneva. And he's going to bring, I think, a more general picture and remarks to the discussion. If it's okay with everybody and with the audience, of course, each of them is going to do a presentation for about 15 minutes, and then it's going to leave time for question and answers. I suggest that we start with Professor Sassoli, then move to maybe Mr. Van Dyke, and finish with Jean-Marie Enkert. If that is all right with you, I suggest we start.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Good afternoon and welcome. The 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. I'm conscious that this is not really a moment for celebration because so many people suffer worldwide from violations of the Geneva Conventions. Nevertheless, personally, but I'm not neutral, I think that the Geneva Conventions of 1949 were a great step for humanity, and I would even call it a common heritage of mankind. In French it's better because it's humanité, it's both mankind and humanity. And somehow I really think that the Geneva Conventions, or their basic idea that even enemies, even people who did injustice to you, to your group, to your state, deserve a minimum of respect when they are hors de combat or when they do not, in any case, directly participate in hostilities. And this is perhaps what makes human beings, that they see other human beings as their fellow human beings, not only those people they like, because we don't need rules on that you treat your friends correctly, but your enemies correctly. And therefore, I think it is very astonishable, but the historian will obviously rightly so nuance that in 1949 it was possible to adopt conventions which, at least for people in the power of a party, were bringing real protection, including an Article 3 common, because in each Geneva Convention there is an Article 3 about non-international armed conflict, and this was the first time that in an international treaty there were automatically applicable rules to non-international armed conflicts. And imagine those who were sitting around the table and negotiating this were the Soviet Union of Stalin and the colonial powers of the time. and nevertheless they accepted rules which do not foresee exceptions, which is important. There is Article 3 protects everyone, including terrorists, foreign fighters, communists, fascists, whatever you don't like, they are protected by Article 3 common, and I must say I'm astonished that, and it's an honor for humanity, and I would say a dishonor for today's states, and sorry, the representatives of those states, that today it's no longer possible to find a consensus on humanitarian rules. You may know that the ICSE and Switzerland have tried but did not find consensus, while in 1949 it was a different world, I agree, and we will hear about this. It was possible to find consensus. Now, I would say, many people say, okay, these conventions of 1949 are no longer adapted to today's realities, and it is true that ideally the conventions should be revised, and in history since 1863, the rhythm at which conventions were updated were always shorter than now. Since 1977, there were the additional protocols, which are very important, but since then, there hasn't been an update. So it would be good, but probably in the present international atmosphere, it is impossible. And I think we can live with the conventions as we have them. Obviously, there are some rules which are outdated, like the advance of pay for a prisoner of war soldier is 8 Swiss francs. You don't per month. Huh? Okay. And hospital ships have no right to send encrypted messages. But you know, today all our portable phones use encryption. Okay, but this is not really a humanitarian problem, that these outdated rules. We can live with them, and most of the rules, and in particular the Article 3 common I'm so obsessed with, are totally fit for purpose. And if today in Yemen or in Syria or in the Central African Republic there was respect of Article 3 common, the situation of the people affected would be totally different. In addition, at least in Geneva, which is a civil law country, we can say that it is the very nature of law that it is also applicable to new situations. You know, when you buy a computer program today in Geneva, you do it according to an article of the Code des Obligations, which is of 1911, and at that time there were no computer programs. But we can live with that law as lawyers, adapting it to new realities, which is obviously more easy in domestic law because there are regular tribunals, which we don't have in international law. And in addition, I think it's not only the adapting to new realities, but also that today we have more and more borderline cases. I explain. International humanitarian law, and this is perhaps one of its features, makes a lot of distinctions between armed conflict, non-armed conflict, international, non-international armed conflict, civilians, combatants, occupied territory, owned territory. The rules are different. And in today's reality, we have more and more phenomena which cannot fit exactly in one of the categories. Think about the people who are they civilians or combatants. Is this or that conflict an international or non-international armed conflict? Is invaded territory already an occupied territory? But this again is something which is not unique in humanitarian law. Think about Uber, but this is not the sponsor of this event. in many countries, including Switzerland, there's the question whether an Uber driver is independent or employed, self-employed or employed. But no one suggests that we abandon in social security law or in labor law the distinction between self-employed and employed. Also, there are more and more phenomena which are somehow at the border, but this is why we need lawyers, and this is why we earn money by training lawyers, to adapt it to the difficult situation. Okay, that a Swiss soldier in uniform is a combatant, you don't need a lot of specialists to find that out. But then, when it comes to the borderline cases there, we need lawyers, and we have lawyers, and I think there too we can live with the law. Now, it is true that there are some issues where we would like to have more detailed rules, like the treatment of detainees in non-international armed conflict, the protection of the environment in armed conflicts. The ICSE suggested that. And finally, there was no consensus by states, perhaps because states are so terribly afraid that every rule they could accept could one day be used against them. Which is indeed the essence of law, that law applies to everyone, including in the future. I think the only fields where my general positive assessment to say it's fit for purpose and with some lawyers-like thinking we can live with the existing law, where we have problems is in cyber warfare, because cyber is an environment to which the law, which very much depends on borders and nationalities and objects, somehow it doesn't fit, and the problem is if you apply it with lawyers like thinking, either you cover too much or too little. So there it wouldn't be good, and there are initiatives which try to clarify what is meant. Another field which in my view is very important is that the law remains realistic for armed groups and that it can be applied to armed groups, which also means you need a dialogue with armed groups, and today obviously armed groups are seen always by every state against which they fight as terrorists, and therefore to have even a discussion with armed groups is seen as a support to terrorism. So here we have a problem that, the rules on armed groups in the Geneva Conventions, at least Article 3 common, is not unrealistic, and it would be good if armed groups complied with at least these rules. The main problem of the Geneva Convention, but this is inherent to international humanitarian law, is that they apply to armed conflicts. And this presupposes first that you have to classify a situation as an armed conflict, and many states are very reluctant to admit that they are confronted to an armed conflict. And second, an armed conflict is not a situation very conducive to the respect of rules. I will come back to that. I think it's even astonishing how well humanitarian law is respected, because imagine, in an armed conflict, the very survival of the individual, of the group, sometimes of the state, is at stake. And then to expect people to comply with rules, it's more difficult than in international telecommunication law. And finally, an important problem is that when you have an armed conflict, there is an impression, I come back to that, and propaganda by both sides to claim that the law is not respected, and this is a self-defeating prophecy. So I think the main challenge is to get better respect of the Geneva Conventions. With those few nuances I mentioned, you know that Switzerland and the ICSC suggested the mechanism to have regular meetings of the states parties. There was no consensus to that, so we have to live with what we have. We obviously have the ICSC, but the ICSC itself agrees that it is not sufficient and there should be something else, because the ICSC is mainly a humanitarian organization and therefore wants to have access to people and to help people. And when it is put before the dilemma to either invoke the Geneva Conventions or to have access, it will always choose access because it wants to help the people. And so there must be another forum to discuss about violations, but we don't have it. We have the important Article 1 common to the Geneva Conventions, which is an article foreseeing that states do not only have to respect but also ensure respect of international humanitarian law. And here we should not be too pessimistic. You know, I often hear, okay, this is the most violated rule of humanitarian law. But, I mean, many states put some pressure, perhaps not enough pressure, on their clients, their friends, the groups they support in all kinds of armed conflicts to say, okay, but now you have to improve your respect of international humanitarian law. And here, obviously, it would be very important that when there is arms trade, sorry to speak about the elephant in the room, when you sell arms, you must also make sure that these arms are used in conformity with international humanitarian law. This a relatively bleak picture on enforcement leads us to think, but perhaps here I'm not neutral, because obviously the Geneva Academy is active in prevention, to say the best chance is prevent. And it is less controversial. I mean, dissemination training, there's consensus that that's a good idea. I think an important thing in training and dissemination is not to have a selective perception, not only to tell you, look, you are the good guys and these are the bad guys and they violate, but to speak also about the respect by the other side, by those people you don't like. I don't know. I don't yet know about my students this year, last year, a lot didn't like Donald Trump. And then the important message is, yes, but the US Armed Forces nevertheless make serious efforts to comply with the IHL and have a very good training system and so on. And this, if my students don't accept this, my dissemination efforts were useless, because if they go out of the course having the impression, okay, there are nice people who respect IHL, but Donald Trump doesn't, then this is not a good starting point, I think, for getting better respect. And I think an important message is also that IHL is more often respected than it could appear when you read the media. This is not criticism of the media, because media would be ridiculous if they were reporting about cases of respect. It's like Geneva newspapers reporting about drivers who respect the traffic laws. No, they make a report about the crazy person who drove at 100 kilometers an hour through the center of Geneva. And the same thing is obviously true for armed conflicts, but I think it would be important to stress that there's also respect, which presupposes, in my view, three things. First, a good understanding of humanitarian law, because often there is the misconception that there are violations which are not violations, like when civilians die because of aerial bombardments, this is not necessarily a violation of IHL. It may be lawful if a legitimate target was targeted and the proportionality principles and precautions were respected. But this is very difficult to bring over, but I think it is important because otherwise you have the impression that there are only violations. And the second point is that, again, you should avoid the selective perception that our guys respect IHL and our enemies don't respect it, because no one wants to be the only idiot who respects the law if they have the impression that others don't respect the law. And so it is important that there are also examples of respect and belief in respect. Now, it's very difficult to have examples. The ICSE has now a database, IHL in Action, which they have also difficulties to find actual examples of respect. But when you work in actual armed conflicts, and I think today it's so long time ago that I may mention that without violating my confidentiality obligations. You know, my first armed conflict was between Iran and Iraq, a terrible war. But nevertheless, for instance, the Iranian prisoners of war in Iraq, and Iraq was an incredibly inhumane regime. Nevertheless, the prisoners of war were more or less treated in conformity with the Third Geneva Convention. But you don't have a lot of articles about this, because this is what we expect. Or say between Eritrea and Ethiopia, two countries involved in a terrible armed conflict, nevertheless, and we know that because there are now, there is an arbitral commission who worked on that, there was quite some respect. So I think we need the Geneva Conventions. We can deal with most problems according to the Geneva Conventions, but we must continue to fight to get a better respect and to avoid the impression that no one respects. Sorry to have been so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sassoli. I think what I hear from you is that states have a lot of responsibility and a big role to play to continue to ensure compliance and respect with it. So I'd be interested to hear what Boyd has to say about what role state played at the time as well.
Yes, thank you, Emily, for the invitation. Thank you for having me here today. So I've been asked to give some critical reflections on the convention history, which is kind of strange if you're celebrating a birthday party, then to give this kind of more or less critical observation on somebody's personality. But I guess that's my task for today. It's a daunting one, and I'm happy to take it up. So, as you've heard, I'm an historian of the Geneva Convention, so I'll give you historical reflections rather than legal reflections about today, but very much also want to talk about the present as well as the future. But if you want to do that, we have to go back to 49 as well as the preceding years when the conventions were made. And I think what's striking about these drafters is that they wanted to come up with a radically new answer to how to regulate armed conflict. So they adopted the right to humane treatment, the principle of non-discrimination, and they believed in the idea that people in wartime, if it's a war within a state or empire, still have rights. So essentially the right to have rights. They also accepted a great number of prohibitions against brutal counterinsurgency measures, from reprisals to hostage-taking, making newspaper headlines across the globe. Some drafters spoke of a moral revolution, of how ideas of rights and humanity radically changed international law itself. Since 1949, a record number of states have adopted as well as ratified the conventions. A system of ratification now stretches across the globe, from this city to North America, to Asia, and Africa. The convention will become a kind of a true lingua franca for armed conflict. Everybody, even if they violate the conventions, talk about it. And I think that's significant, mainly because of the ICRC's efforts to disseminate IHL on a global scale. The convention's making is widely lauded by many, especially this year because of the celebrations. But its history is popularly understood only by a few, I would say. One common historical error is to believe that the conventions were based on a liberal and humanitarian blueprint. But many drafters were far from liberal. We already heard the Soviet Union, I think that's a really good example to start with. What's striking is that the Soviets acted in surprisingly close cooperation with the ICRC, making a critical contribution to the efforts to make an end to inhumane measures in wartime. That's something you don't expect. Two organizations which continue to have all kinds of tensions throughout their history now work together. So drafters from across the political spectrum, from socialists to liberals, were able to come up with an agreement on what is lawful and unlawful in wartime, despite clashing on countless issues related to the law's future. Whereas the Soviets wished to place restraints on aerial bombardment as a response to the destruction in Hiroshima, as well as Dresden, Anglo-American delegates fiercely opposed this. They really rejected anything that could place a restraint on their air weapon. Whereas Jean-Pictet, Jean-Marie's predecessor, tried to apply the conventions to wars within states and empires, he clashed with colonial powers. That's also what you've already mentioned. And I think it's also a question that we should think about, particularly in this place, the former villa of Gustave Moynier. And whereas Anglo-American delegates tried to empower the ICRC's position, the Soviets wanted to reject this, or actually rejected this, throughout the whole negotiation. And mainly because they feared international supervisors would come and visit their Gulag archipelago. Behind a seemingly calm discussion of the conventions, wrote a Soviet delegate later, a fierce fight had been lingering between the drafters. End of quote. So this is not a harmonious discussion among lawyers. This is really a struggle about what it means to humanize or restrict war in ways that could make it more humane. Their work ultimately produced humane and inhumane consequences, just as it had inclusive and exclusive impulses. For instance, the Civilian Convention, officially seeking to protect non-combatants against inhumane treatment, remained deliberately silent on air and atomic warfare, mainly due to continuing Anglo-American opposition. So another error would be to assume that the drafters universally shared a resolve to eradicate all the war's atrocities. That's just a story you often hear, of course. Such reductionism, although temptingly reassuring, is, I think, historically problematic. And we should think about this more than we tend to do. So in other words, we have to be careful not to commit the sin of historical anachronism, of projecting our understanding onto a distant past to make inferences about the future, so what we want to do different in the future. I believe it's crucial to bear in mind that the conventions were also understood and arranged in seemingly contradictory ways. Seemingly because we may see it as contradiction, but the drafters back then thought that was perfectly normal. Among other seeming contradictions, they rejected deportations while expelling millions of Germans from their home after 1945. And they outlawed extermination in response to the Holocaust while privately contemplating its nuclear equivalent. You, of course, have to be aware that the Americans already had a nuclear weapon, Soviets were developing one, and they were willing to use it in the future. So what lessons, if there are lessons to be learned from history, can we draw from this past? As an historian, I'm skeptical about the idea that we can learn lessons from the past. But leaving this skepticism aside, I think 4 lessons may stand out. First, history is not a magical tool. I wish it was, because that's my job, to study history, but it's not a magical tool. It cannot predict the future. But it can remind us of warning signals, offering opportunities to think about how to meet the challenges of our time, which you have introduced already. For instance, it tells us that there existed no inevitable path from the war's atrocities to 1949, or that multilateral agreements can be made despite major great power tensions. 1949, of course, is around the start of the Cold War. Decolonization was happening. Wars of decolonization too. So if the conventions are to survive, and I'm certainly optimistic about this idea, I believe their champions will need to engage with these historical insights to act with credibility in the future. Second, during the historical moment of the Cold War, with tensions mounting among the great powers, Pictet's drafting team succeeded in placing a significant footprint not just on the conventions, but on international law at large. Drafters such as Pictet were obviously shaped by circumstances and historical changes that they could not control themselves at the moment as we were making it. They were products of their own time, influenced by concerns about new weaponry, great power tensions, fears of war, and refugee crises. Questions that may ring a bell among some of you. But how they reacted to such developments and challenges matters enormously. I think that's the reason why we should talk about history here. The actions made a difference, no matter how contested their legacies are, and can be seen as a source of inspiration for transformative legal work in the future. Third, that the drafters failed to come up with a comprehensive legal package 70 years ago should not surprise us. Our own inability to achieve similar goals, such as eradicating nuclear weapons, should make us humble and give us some pause and soften our criticism of what drafters did accomplish. We should give them some credit at least. Most importantly, they were able to agree upon some fundamental issues despite the Cold War and wars of decolonization. If you think our time is tough to develop all kinds of rules for IHL, what do you think of the 1940s? 4, the fact that conventions have not always delivered on their official promises, or that they are frequently violated, or may look old-fashioned to the contemporary eye, is not a reason to consider them outdated or failed. Over the years, I've come to realize that many of Geneva's failures were not always due to the decisions taken in 1949, but rather to what came after, the decisions taken by their successors in failing to apply the conventions in an effective and a humane fashion. Drafters' work remains remarkably influential. Since 1949, former drafters have tried to escape from the prison of history for embracing new attempts to keep the conventions legally and practically impactful. And we have here one at the table, maybe even two. Their work illustrates IHL's ability to change, to adapt to new circumstances. Legal interpretations not only evolve because of new generational demands, what we think is morally important, but it can also create more humane understanding when speaking to contemporary needs. At the same time, celebrating convention's birthday should not make us complacent. I think it's an important lesson we should draw from this history. Nor should it turn our minds in the wrong analytical directions, ignoring the historical warnings voiced by critics already in 1949, the moment when these conventions were adopted. When they were signed in August of that year, or around that year, Urs Lauderpact, a former member of the British prosecuting team, a very prominent international lawyer, worried that their core idea of humanizing warfare was perhaps too selective, maybe even too hierarchical in its aims. Others were concerned that leaving the air weapon deregulated, as the conventions did in most cases, while strictly outlawing so-called minor evils, think of torture, would send the wrong signal. Humanized war, they fear, would fail to shock the conscience of mankind and kind of lower the threshold of war itself. Maybe we are focusing too much of our energy on making war more humane. Maybe we should also think about ending it, preventing it. At least that was Lauderpact's fear. Why, they asked, should we concentrate our moral energy on limiting the effects of war rather than eliminating its root causes? And I think that's a fundamental question that has not lost its relevance in our time. Think of the so-called ongoing war on terror. It also raises critical questions about today's purpose of IHL and what unites us as scholars, as practitioners, as diplomats, and whose interests we should serve primarily. Is it of justice? Is it of humanity, mankind as you call it, maybe the individual, or your state? Today's legal system struggles to cope with new challenges and power shifts. The emergence of non-state actors, the invention of automated weapons, ostensibly challenging the principles of IHL, the escalation of cyber attacks and other developments that can pose a serious danger to stability within and among states. Here I want to highlight one particular development that disturbs me especially: the revival of what I call inhumane arguments already discredited in 1949. Condoning torture, criminalizing humanitarian action, placing new destructive weapons outside of IHL scope, and inflating conceptions of military necessity. All these recent attempts to undermine the conventions, and there are many of these attempts, should remind us of alarming analogies to debates from 1949. If ever confronted with those proposals, Claude Pillou, an influential former ICRC drafter, a colleague of Pictet, would have probably responded with great concern. Back in 1949, he already complained that similar proposals coming from states to undermine his drafting team's plans were essentially endorsing the very same things for which the Nazis were being tried at a tribunal in Nuremberg. And this is coming from an ICRC official. To be sure, he said this privately, he did not see these publicly. Today's world is obviously not wholly comparable, however, to the one emerging from the dark days of the Second World War. We're living in a different time. Yet historical distancing risks ignoring or underestimating the potential revival of the evils from the past, if you want to call them that way. The good news is that it's difficult to imagine that the convention would ever collapse, that it would completely evaporate. The bad news, however, is that it's far from certain that their core principles will ultimately survive. But one wonders, at least me as an historian wonders, how recent history might have unfolded if the drafters, instead of taking a revolutionary radical approach, had ignored the laws of war after Hitler's atrocities. What if Pillou or Pictet had simply limited his moral energy to criminalizing aggression, as the UN International Law Commission did in 1949, by removing the laws of war from its agenda? It would put it back on the agenda only years later. So how would today's world look like, or would have looked like, in such a scenario? How would our planet look like without the Geneva Conventions? That's the question I want to put on the table for you to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I personally appreciate having food for thought on those issues because I think learning from history is very important, especially now where in the current political climate we tend just to assume or accept that, it's not the right political time to come up with new rules or update the one that we have, and maybe we shouldn't be that defeated by the current climate if the drafters managed to achieve what they did in 1949. But speaking of the future and of, making the law that we have as relevant as we can, I think the ICRC's work in updating the commentaries of the Geneva Convention is very relevant. So Jean-Marie.
Yes, thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to share some ideas about this project that we're undertaking to update the commentaries on the Geneva Conventions. As Professor Sassoli has said, we would like to and we would need to maybe update the conventions, but it seems very difficult to achieve that. They've been updated several times in history, right, in different intervals, but right now it's been a long time. And we haven't updated them, and we've tried on limited initiatives, and it hasn't worked, as was mentioned. So a separate track of work is updating the commentaries on the Geneva Conventions. And those commentaries were drafted right after the conventions were adopted by the same team that was in the negotiations for the ICRC. Some names have been mentioned, Jean Pictet, Claude Pillou, and others. So they started drafting a commentary article by article right after the conventions were adopted, and then they were published in the 1950s. So they were explaining what they thought the meaning was of each article based on the negotiating history, so what we call in French the travaux préparatoires, the preparatory work, and also on prior practice, mainly because the conventions were based on prior practice, namely the Second World War and the civil wars in Spain and Greece for Common Article 3. So it was, based on the prior practice, what happened, what were the problems encountered in the Second World War, and why the conventions needed to be what they were, and what that meant for the meaning of those texts. So explaining the articles in light of the negotiations and the prior practice. The fact that they were done in the 1950s, of course, means that today they are, to some extent, outdated, but even more so, I would say, incomplete, because we've had many developments in the way the conventions are applied and interpreted that obviously the drafters of those commentaries couldn't reflect because they published it in 1950. So they didn't know, what would happen afterwards, how the conventions would be applied. They didn't know. There was no experience other than the prior experience, in the application of the conventions. So, and now, of course, we have that experience, and we can base ourselves in the interpretation on that experience. And we're not doing this simply because we think it's a good thing. It's actually, this method is endorsed by one of the fundamental treaties of international law is the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which says that treaties have to be interpreted based obviously on their wording, the actual meaning of the words, but then also in light of subsequent practice and in light of other relevant treaties. So the Geneva Conventions have to be interpreted over time in light of other treaties. They are not an isolated set of 4 conventions like no other treaty is, but they are part of a web of international law and have to be interpreted in a harmonious manner to fit within that system. So that's why, this project looks at, rather than the previous practice, looks at the subsequent practice in how the conventions since 1949 have been applied and interpreted. And so that's 70 years of practice. 70 years of practice. So that's one of the major differences, I would say, or the main difference with the initial so-called Pictet commentaries. 4 books, a commentary on each of the 4 conventions, subsequent practice rather than prior practice. And also the Vienna Convention, and of course taking into account those other relevant treaties which have evolved since 1949, like the Convention Against Torture, for example, other human rights treaties, the Articles on State Responsibility, which did not exist in 1949. So that means that our project, of course, has to look at that state practice and look at jurisprudence also. That's also an important element. Case law has also clarified a lot of aspects of the Geneva Conventions. For example, the ICTY and the ICTR and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Those are, of course, important in those contexts for purposes of providing justice and punishing the most serious war crimes, but they're also important for lawyers to clarify certain concepts. For example, the concept of non-international armed conflict, which is key to apply in Common Article 3, was not really clarified in the commentary of 1949, or not definitively, and now we have a more definitive definition through the case law of the ICTY. So we look at that subsequent state practice, jurisprudence, literature. We also look at our own archives to see how conventions have been applied and interpreted. And just today we were discussing about, I'm just taking one step back, that treaties and the Geneva Conventions have to be interpreted in light of other relevant treaties, and so that the Geneva Conventions are part of a network of international law that has developed very significantly since the Second World War, with human rights treaties, refugee law, state responsibility. A number of aspects have been clarified. And so in the Geneva Conventions today, we were looking at the financial resources of prisoners of war, and so this is also impacted by international financial law. There are articles dealing with the wills of prisoners of war, and that's private international law. There are labor of prisoners of war, and that's international labor law, and there's health law. So the Geneva Conventions sit there, as part of a network of other treaties, and they're related to a lot of other issues. So we also, that's a challenge for any field, of course, is to specialize in one area and to then feel comfortable knowing that area, but we have to also be able, and with the Geneva Conventions as well, to step outside of that area and see what is beyond and take into account other fields of international law. So that's one major difference is subsequent practice and other relevant treaties which have developed since then. The other big difference in the way we carry out this project is that we've opened this up to external input in terms of the various review processes, and in particular we have external contributors and also an external members of the editorial committee, of which Professor Sassoli is one member. But very importantly, we have a peer review of some 50 people from around the world who give us feedback based on their perspective, and this also is very important in bringing the Geneva Conventions to where they're actually applied and seeing the different perspectives from people in Ukraine or in Colombia or in other parts that have witnessed our conflict, or people that are in the armed forces or that in the medical service of the armies, to see what challenges they see and how they look at these articles. So this peer review process is, I think, very enriching. It's very time-consuming, but very enriching and important that nowadays, of course, we open up such a process of updating the commentaries to external input, which was not at all the case in 1950s when Pictet and his colleagues drafted the commentaries. There was no external input, excuse me. And finally, also in light of the flair of the time, let's say, or the current standards of academic publications, is that the commentary will reflect ICRC views, but also main diverging views. So we are not putting forward just one interpretation if we know that there are diverging views. For example, with respect to Common Article 1, which is an article Professor Sassoli has mentioned, we put forward the ICRC's view, but we also reflect and recognize, and we know that there are diverging views, that there are states which do not agree with that interpretation. So we don't want to hide that. I think that's also scientifically important to be transparent in that regard. So the outcome of the project is, for the moment, that we've published two updated commentaries, namely on the first and the second Geneva Convention, and we are now trying to finalize. We are finalizing the commentary on the third Geneva Convention, and we plan to launch it in March next year. But the outcome and the impact of subsequent practice you can see by just looking at the commentary on Common Article 3. And I mean, I'm coming back to that important article. In the initial commentary, the commentary on Common Article 3 was 25 pages. And in the new commentary, it's 200 pages. And that's by being very limited. I mean, because on all the concepts in Common Article 3, what is an armed conflict, what is torture, what is inhumane treatment, what is cruel treatment, what is hostage taking, one could write a law review article, one could even write a whole book, and books have been written on this. So, but we try to be as long as necessary to grasp the essential aspects of each legal concept, but as short as possible, so that the commentaries still remain a practical tool that is very accessible for diplomats and practitioners and legal advisors in government, so that they can easily find the essential developments, let's say, since 1949. That's what it tries to summarize, what has happened on this concept since 1949 in terms of practice and case law. So, so this is, for example, the commentary on Common Article 3 in Spanish, which we presented last week. So this is now in itself a little book, which in Spanish became a bit longer, as always the case with translations, of 300 pages. So initially this was 25 pages in the initial commentary, because concepts like humane treatment that has been referred to, if you read the Pictet commentary, you say we don't need to define humane treatment because we all know what it means. And it's even dangerous to define it because we might miss things that we cannot think of, that acts of brutality or inhumanity that people might invent in the future. So also we better don't define it. But of course today we have a lot of developments in this area, in particular through the case law of the ICTY, and we also need to know clearly what is cruel treatment, what is inhumane treatment, what is torture. All of them, of course, are prohibited, but it was necessary in the framework of that tribunal to delimit them and to define them more clearly. But we also have definitions of hostage taking more clearly now because of the special tribunal, special court for Sierra Leone, And we have additional elements, of course, coming from the negotiations of the International Criminal Court statute. So that's why this commentary on Common Article 3 has expanded, because there is much more clarity on concepts on what is an armed conflict, the beginning of an armed conflict and the end of armed conflict also. And also new issues are addressed that, the drafters in 1949 didn't foresee in relation, for example, to the geographic scope of application of Common Article 3 of IHL in these non-international armed conflicts. So, for example, with issues related to spillover conflicts or trans-border non-international armed conflicts. So those were not at all addressed in the initial commentary because they hadn't happened or they were not foreseen. And I think in 1949 no one could have foreseen, I don't know if anyone could have foreseen the importance that article would gain over time. It was already mentioned during the negotiations that it was a convention in miniature. But for me, so of course the page range is not the most important, but just visually to see how it became from 25 pages of commentary with not defining certain concepts and not addressing others, how it became in itself a commentary very much summarizing a lot of already 200 pages. So that is really a reflection of the developments that have taken place since 1949. And so that's what today I think we can celebrate or not. It's always an odd feeling to celebrate the Geneva Conventions, and our work is kind of odd, like working on the third Geneva Conventions. I'm telling my colleagues, we should actually hope that our commentary is never used. We're writing something that we hope will never be used, that it will not be relevant. But on the other hand, we know there are international armed conflicts, there are prisoners of war today, and so it remains relevant, unfortunately. But of course, we will carry on our work, and I think this is one way of keeping the conventions alive and making sure that they can be applied in the current situation. As Professor Sassoli has said, treaties have to be applied, and lawyers do this kind of work, is applying old texts to new situations. And so much of the Geneva Conventions are still fit for purpose, and definitely Common Article 3. And so I will leave it at that and look forward to your questions and our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've heard, I think, many interesting and complementary elements. Is there any question, hopefully, from the floor to either of our panelists, or from one panelist to the other, maybe, if you've been intrigued by aspects? Yes.
Hi, I'm Matt from International Commission of Jurists. Thanks very much for these presentations. It's been very, very interesting. My question is about dissemination, which is something that Marco Sassoli mentioned at the beginning, and the sort of future strength of the enforcement of the conventions. I mean, I guess arguably today we live in a world that's more democratic, more transparent. Governments are perhaps more responsive to popular opinion than they were in the 1940s. I know, having looked at ICRC commissioned surveys, that on issues like prisoner treatment and torture in particular, there are very wide variations between different countries in the level of popular support for, say, the Geneva Convention provisions prohibiting torture. And in fact, some Western countries have very shockingly high levels of popular support for torturing prisoners of war in certain circumstances, at least. I mean, there are the provisions at the end of each convention that require states to disseminate. And they do make reference to the aim of making of general civic education and making the principles of the conventions known to the entire population. So my question is, are any of you aware, are there studies that show our states actually implementing this? Does primary and secondary education in countries across the world, to what degree does it include education on the principles of the convention? obviously everyone on the podium is involved in that process of education, so I'm not, in any way detracting from what you do, but to really intervene at this much earlier age than the people in this room generally at like the primary and secondary education level. So my question is this something that there's information about what states do today, and if so, what does it say? I guess all of this aiming at, I think like other areas of international law, we're no longer in an era where military or other elites can maintain the system over the long term unless populations actually support it. Thanks.
This is obviously an essential issue. I have, unfortunately, unfortunately for human rights law, the impression that there is more challenge of the basic idea of human rights law than of humanitarian law. Somehow humanitarian law is more like motherhood and apple pie. Everyone says, yes, we want it. The problem being that including those who disseminate don't dare to say it's about enemies. And so I would say with my granddaughter who is 7 years old to tell her, is there anyone in your class you don't like, who is unjust with you? This person deserves a minimum of humane treatment. And not if that person is falling into the water, you take that person out and so on. So, to answer your question, I don't know whether the ICRC has made a study. I'm only aware of National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. For instance, in two countries I lived, in Jordan, the Jordanian Red Crescent is very much involved in training children. But obviously you have to translate it to say, okay, help your comrade, and I would add, help the comrade you don't like. And the Canadian Red Cross is also quite active in trying at school level to bring the basic message through, but it would be interesting to know whether in the school programs where today a lot of civic education and so on is rightly so, I think, injected, whether anyone knows how much this also comprises the idea of international humanitarian law, which in my view is nevertheless slightly different than that of human rights law.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a global survey of any sort, but for instance, the Geneva Red Cross is very involved and has a lot of activities aimed at primary school and middle school children, and they work a lot with the Red Cross Museum, for instance. They also organize sort of, role play exercises, so that they do. But fortunately, we have with us the ICRC someone from the ICRC who's in charge of relations with academia, who might be able to say a little bit more about that.
So my name is Etienne Kester. I'm working with academia for the ICRC. So I'll rather talk about the estimates we have for universities. We had, as regards primary education, we had a program called Exploring Humanitarian Law, which was very successful, and it still is, I believe, but which is now mostly handled by National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. The ICRC is not anymore doing this program. As concerns universities, I can only provide some estimates, actually. We don't have specific figures, but I wrote an article on that. It's called Promoting IHL with Universities. You can find it if you Google it. And in our estimates, last year in 2018, the ICRC was interacting with over 900 universities worldwide, and we estimate that 2/3 of those interactions regarded IHL dissemination at some point. So this gives you an idea that I think it is safe to assume that probably there is at least one university per country which proposes IHL teaching in one way or the other. this being said, those are estimates, so we have to be cautious with that. What's very interesting is how you can measure that achievement, if you want to say, with any benchmark, because we didn't have such figures in the 70s, for instance. There is an excellent article by Professor Francois Hanson in the 70s saying that it's hard to find an IHL handbook, which gives you maybe an idea that indeed there was probably much less IHL teaching in universities in the 70s. Now, my personal reconcile this idea that today we have a lot about IHL teaching in academia, in influential centers, etc., and still so shocking IHL violations, at least in 2 or 3 main conflicts around the world. So building a critical mass of expertise, I think, is well ongoing, so to speak, even if it still needs to be maintained and developed. But then we have also to see how we can use that in a better way to make sure that such violations are less blatant and less shocking and do not appear in the first place. Thank you.
Thanks, Etienne. Any other question? Yeah.
Actually, just to add to the previous conversation, there's a whole concept of human rights education that I'm sure many here are aware of. UNESCO's done a lot of work on that, and some countries do that quite successfully. And I was wondering whether any of the experts in the room were aware of whether there were discussions or efforts to try to incorporate, in particular IHL, but also to some degree refugee law, I don't know, international criminal law, whether that's quite as relevant for little kids into those kinds of curricula at the national level. Because if I think of, I have young kids myself, if I think of when I try to, as a human rights lawyer, teach them some of the basics, or rather bring it into our daily rhetoric at the dinner table, the distinctions between the different bodies of law, that's all fine for law students, but sort of for children, I think, as much as these are different bodies of law with different bases, with different normative bases, with different underlying rationales, for children, I somehow think that all of these should be part of human rights education. So just a question about whether that is the case or whether there's efforts to do that.
I don't know if that's the case with the UNESCO program, but we can inquire. And as Etienne has said, we had this EHL program, so not IHL, but EHL,
Exploring Humanitarian Law.
Exploring Humanitarian Law. And that's been handed over to National Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. So in some countries, this has been integrated into curricula, but I don't think we monitor that now, and so we have no overview. So
what we can mention regarding the question is that in general, and it's still the case for the university program, there is a two-track approach. So we do work with the education ministries whenever we can to have such agreements. We just had actually one with the CAMES, which is Conseil Africain Malgache pour l'Enseignement Supérieur, so for the whole Francophone Africa. And we successfully managed to have IHL integrated as a course, a compulsory course for universities of those states. For schools, actually, for secondary, primary schools, this was also the approach when the ICRC had this program. Now, with the national societies, I could not say where they stand with that.
Any other questions?
May I make an unpopular remark on this? I think, yes, it must be integrated. There are nevertheless slight differences between human rights education and what I perceive as IHL education, and here I speak just as a former father and now grandfather. What is important and legitimate in human rights education is to tell them about their rights. While in IHL, to tell the children in Gaza about how the Israelis should bomb, I don't think this will be very useful, and vice versa. So it is very much about the rights of your enemies, which is a less popular thing, even with children, than to say, you have rights. Oh, even my granddaughter already, she's in Canada, so they learn about all their rights, and she comes and says, I have a right not to do. Yes, but the message to say, okay, but you have also obligations not to do with your comrade, especially the one you don't like. That's more difficult, the message.
When
Yes,
here,
let me also thank the panelists for their insightful contributions. There's been a series of criticism against the 1949 Convention, and among them, like Professor Sulis clearly puts it, people begin to wonder, whether in fact the 1949 Convention actually meets the realities of today's warfare. And additionally, there's a question with respect to non-state actors and the fact that the document itself does not address or adequately address warfare. These are series of criticism. So I'd like the panelists to actually put the perspective on it. To the extent of those criticism lending the 1949 Convention redundant.
Could you repeat the last question? I didn't hear it.
So I was putting forward a couple of criticism that has been levied against the 1949 Convention. So my question is, how severe is criticism to the extent that it could render the 1949 Convention redundant?
Redundant?
Yeah.
Because of inconsistencies?
Well, the criticism.
Criticism.
because of the criticism, are they so severe that they mean that the
yes,
conventions
are
are?
so severe, yeah.
Well, I think, as Professor, but others can add, Professor Sassoli has said, they are an achievement of humanity, sort of a common heritage of mankind. So, in my humble opinion, I think that they have well withstood the criticism that was rendered very strongly also after 9/11, 2001. And so that much of the discourse today, as has been mentioned by others, is in the framework of the Geneva Conventions, and usually also states argue within that framework and justify their actions within that framework. So it is really, I think, universally ratified, but also universally seen as a framework by which to judge action. And that's maybe what we see now today, and why the violations are so stark, is that because everyone knows what the rules are, and everyone knows that we can hold leaders and military accountable vis-à-vis those rules. So the real issue is the blatant disrespect in some circumstances. I don't know how it was in the 1960s or 70s, when there were also violations in El Salvador and Angola and Mozambique, but I don't think that was so much in the news and that the world population was so much aware of it as it is today with regard to, let's say, Yemen or Syria. So where we are shocked when there is an attack and then a wedding party is bombed, then I think almost, I don't know how many people, but we'll have the reflection that, is this a military objective? Was this disproportionate or not? So immediately the actions in armed conflict are assessed on the basis of the rules. The rules are thereby not put in question, but the rules are made very relevant and say this is actually relevant today, and this law unfortunately still is relevant. So that's what I think. And today's realities of warfare is a little bit of cyber warfare, but the majority, of course, what we see on TV is more the traditional types of warfare to which the Geneva Conventions still very much apply and are still relevant.
Do you want to compliment?
Yeah, may I just take advantage that we have a historian on our panel to be... You mentioned about the new phenomenon of armed groups. I think we have to distinguish. First, armed groups were always a reality of armed conflicts. Think about the Napoleonian Wars in Spain, the Guerra de Independencia for the Spanish. This is exactly the one who guerrilleros who were fighting against the French troops, or think about all European history is more about armed groups than about state armies. But it is true that 150 years ago, 200 years ago, at least the law became much more concentrated on states. But it is simply not true, but you shouldn't hesitate to correct me, that the phenomenon is new. Simply, the law we have for 1949 is still very much concentrating on states. While we had the Spanish Civil War, we had all the fighting in the colonial wars, as they were pulled at the time, which simply was ignored. But at least we have this Article 3 comment, where there is perhaps, but again, Spanish history, and this is one of the few I know, makes me doubt where there is a certain new phenomenon is that armed groups are less hierarchically structured. But this doesn't raise a real problem with the substantive rules, but indeed the implementation and enforcement becomes more complicated because you cannot speak with the leadership, and the leadership then gives order to the subordinates, and the law will be respected. While if you have very decentralized armed groups, but my feeling is in the Spanish resistance against Napoleon, sorry that I come always with this example, this was quite similar, that they were not, but perhaps there's a historical study about that. So it's not so new, but it gives particular problems when you want to enforce the law, when you have these decentralized groups where you don't know who is who and who is responsible and so on.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see, of course, that two legal experts feel the force of history by means of my presence. That they every time I have to say, maybe I have to be corrected here. Having said that, I think what distinguishes my approach from my colleagues here, of course, is that I do not have a direct stake in the convention's future. So I would say we should think about the moral principles lying behind these conventions. Our moral objective should not be to just keep those conventions in place because we think they're important. We should think about the principles that lie behind them that we think are important, of course. And how do we do that may change over time. That's something about what I, as a historian, would say. This means, of course, that this doesn't mean, of course, that I want to say we could just get rid of the conventions. If you listen very closely to what I said before, of course, I made a plea in favor of the conventions. But that should not force us into a direction that make us only focus on how can we keep those protections or these conventions in place without thinking about the larger questions that we face in our time. Could be cyber warfare, could be armed groups. I agree, however, on the point of the idea that guerrillas or rebels or whatever you want to call them, or terrorists, are not necessarily new. We can find plenty of similar examples in the past, but there are some striking differences, especially in how law is applied to these categories and what kind of legal expectations we have from these groups. In 49, of course, colonial empires, which were dominant, were very reluctant to have any form of international law applied to these kind of categories. They wanted them to deal with them through domestic law, criminal law, but not international law or any equivalent of those things. So they wanted to treat them as traitors and then punish them. That's essentially their strategy. But mainly because of the ICRC and other actors as well in that story that I reconstructed in my work, the colonial powers eventually had to accept some form of law applying to these sort of conflicts. Could be civil war, could be colonial war, something in between, or a combination of the two. And that's a striking normative change of the 1940s. So I agree here with Jean-Marie on that point, that it's also interesting, of course, that in itself, that's a remarkable historical change. At the same time, if you look at newspapers, if you look at what drafters were talking about in the 1940s, they will usually not credit commonography as the most important innovation. It's something we think now, and that's why we have these commentaries that are also grown in size from 25 to 250 pages. So it seems that also our moral perceptions have changed over time, what we think is morally important. back then, most people, most drafters or contemporaries or people just reading newspapers of Geneva Conventions and that they were signed, thought about the Civilian Convention, that finally civilians have rights in wartime. That's a remarkable change. So I think this story really makes us think about how can we see the conventions as a body of law, and how can also these interpretations of this body of law change over time. So this means if we accept historical contingency, that is, historical interpretations change over time, we can also unmake certain things that happen in our own time. Could be armed groups not complying with IHL, or other actors not complying with IHL. We can also counter that, because history is contingent.
Thanks. There was a question over there.
Thank you. I just have two questions. One for Boyd and the other for Jean-Marie. It's interesting having your perspective from a historical lens. I think one thing that really struck me about the conventions is the fact that they were made in a context of a reaction to what had happened before. And they were very reactive in a sense, very much backward-looking, I would say. I guess my question is, and I know you're skeptical about learning from history, but how can we, in a sense, learn from history, looking forward, in terms of being more proactive, in terms of, legislating about these things from an international perspective? Are there any insights you could give on that front? The other question is for Jean-Marie. I'm particularly curious about the second Geneva Protocol, which I think is an invisible protocol. I mean, second Geneva Convention, which I think is an invisible convention in many ways. Also considering that, the commentary came out pretty fast compared, for example, now to the third convention. I was wondering whether, again, it's kind of linked to Boyd's question. Are we missing out on something? Probably because we don't have as many conflicts now that would require the application of that convention, and probably it's not as much practice. But are we missing an opportunity where we could be more proactive in terms of pushing the law in the right direction?
Thank you. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for the great question. It allows me also to say something about my book, which is hopefully coming out soon. So the provisional title of the book is Preparing for War. So the suggestion behind that title, of course, is that these drafters were not so much thinking only about the Second World War, but rather about the present and the future. They're preparing for new armed conflicts that would break out in future days. So a very strong, I think, perception that exists in the literature, whether it's people here at the table or people have a sense of what the conventions are and where they come from, is the idea, of course, that they are retroactive. So something went wrong in World War II, we're going to repair the damage that was done, and then we're going to develop a new law. I think it's a very strong view held among many people in the field. I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. I'm just saying it's extremely one-sided, and it allows us, or in that respect, not allow us to think about what these drafters will really imagine themselves when taking up questions like, how can we humanize war? How can we place restraints on wartime? I think what they were really doing at the time was how to create rules and definitions for key concepts that allow them to be used in the future or not be used. I mean, we have to also keep in mind that they're not just Jean-Pierre Tess and Claude Pouilloux or the Jean-Maries of the 21st century. You also have state delegates who have very strong interest in particular domains. And they may have also incentives to have law not applied to particular actions that they're conducting. So if we take that position also into account, we come up with, I think, a very different view of the conventions in which ideas play a role. So not just the idea that, something went wrong in the past, we're going to repair it. No, we're going to reframe and revolutionize the law in the way it exists and develop something new that help protect civilians against inhumane treatment, for instance. But also allow us to see how states, or even the ICRC, which also have particular interest in that domain, try to merge these ideas with state interest or visions of world order, or even ideas of empire, which I think were also critical for how law was developed in the 1940s. So really, if you can keep one thing in mind for what I said today, is that these individuals are not thinking only about the past, but as much about the present, maybe even more about the future.
Thank you.
Yes, I agree with that, and of course, what I was saying about, based on prior practices for the interpretation and by the lawyers, but I've read some of Boyd's articles and others on this to say that in 1949 they were also looking forward, of course, because some of the states at the negotiations, in particular, like with the Fourth Convention, were preparing for future occupations. So that's why the Fourth Convention has some protections, but also has some weaknesses, I think. It's not as strong as it could be today, because states were also thinking that they would be occupying in the future. And also Common Article 3 is not as strong as it could be. It's a minimum set of rules, but some didn't want it to be much stronger because they were, of course, foreseeing that they might have non-international conflicts in the future. With respect to the second Geneva Convention dealing with protection of wounded, sick and shipwrecked on conflict at sea meaning on water, meaning including inland waters, so it's quite comprehensive in geographic scope, but it's a mirror convention of the first, which applies on land, and the second applies at sea. So you could also have had one convention protecting the wounded, sick and shipwrecked, and then it would, that would have been possible. But they really decided a geographic delimitation, like if you fly a wounded and sick person in a medical aircraft over land, that person is protected by the first convention, and as soon as the aircraft is above water, that person is protected by the second convention. So it's maybe what Marco said in the beginning, that in IHL there are a lot of distinctions like that, and he named a few, and this is another one between GC1 and GC2, land and sea, but at the end the underlying values and the underlying principles and rules are very much the same, and some articles are even the same. Beyond the common articles, which are the same, there are some common articles between GC1, the first, and the second Geneva Convention. So one of the challenges today, of course, with that convention is, there's several, but one is how you would be able to collect shipwrecked persons today in an armed attack, which could be followed up by an additional attack on a ship, and which put in danger the persons collecting the shipwrecked. And if you wouldn't collect the shipwrecked, then there's already not so much protection left. So that's one of the challenges in the commentary on that article. Another issue which we discovered updating the commentary was the relationship, again, with other areas of international law, also in relation to collecting persons at sea, in relation to other conventions, like developed in the framework of the International Maritime Organization. So, and that's a new area of new issues that we discovered and we discussed with the IMO and discussed in other meetings, and some research has been done on that now and been published. And the third issue I would like to say is that there is work going on, just started last week, to update the San Remo manual on naval warfare, which brings together not only the issues about protection of wounded, sick and shipwrecked at sea, but also the conduct of hostilities aspects. So it's probably very complementary to the commentary on the Second Geneva Convention, and it's another example of how we cannot update the conventions, and probably we would also need to update the Second Convention. But since that's very difficult, we are updating scholarly commentaries on the law. So that's what I would like to say. But definitely, yes, there would be a lot to be updated in that convention and to be developed. But as you say, since we have little practice, so it would require a lot of forward thinking. And that's maybe also not something that we would like to highlight, like we want to say, oh, we need to update the Second Geneva Conventions. Why? Because are we foreseeing something? Is something going to happen in that area? And that's not the message. I mean, there's always this tension between developing IHL to prepare for war, but on the other hand, the UN and all states should work for peace. So there is that tension.
Thank you. Oh, wonderful. I'll go maybe with George, and then Etienne, and then
you. Just maybe also a question again for Jean-Marie. You have been involved in different projects with the ICRC, including the customer law study, but also the commentaries. And through the work on the updating the commentaries, most probably you also went again through the practice. How much do you think the original commentaries from the team of Jean Pictet influenced the generation of state practice and how things evolved after the adoption of the convention? So whatever you saw within this period, from the adoption till now. Probably you're going through this right now through updating the commentaries.
Yes.
Some of the notions, for example, obviously one that is most favorite for me, prohibition of adverse distinction, was not really defined, or there was no consensus at the time of the adoption what it exactly meant, but it was kind of taken for granted by the delegations, and it was adopted in that form. How much do you think the original commentaries of Pictet and the team influenced how state practice evolved in that regard, for example?
I mean, I haven't done a scientific study with percentages, which would be nice. But working now on the Third Geneva Convention, as you know, one of the very influential manuscripts on the Third Geneva Convention is Howard Levy's book on the treatment of prisoners of war. And seeing how often it refers to the Pictet commentaries, and how then recent US manual also refers to both Levy and the Pictet commentaries. So you see that where the commentaries gave more details, this often influenced later on drafters of manuscripts or manuals. And to the extent that it was lacking, of course, it didn't influence, and there was more room then for others, other academics or courts to define these concepts. But I think it has had impact. But I can't give you a sort of scientific overview or a scientific estimate, which would be interesting, though, to know.
Thank you. Etienne?
Yeah, maybe related to that, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the update of the San Remo manual. Actually, to my knowledge, the first IHL manual we can speak of is the Oxford manual, which was published in 1880 by the Institute of International Law, and Gustave Moignet was the secretary who also drafted this manual. And it is striking to see that several provisions of this manual that are really textually the same as provisions in the later on Geneva Conventions or the Hague Convention. So I think when it comes to the work of academics and how it can be influential not only to the IHL text but also to ultimately the protection of people in the battlefield, we should not underestimate this dimension. I think the ICRC is very keen on working with academics. It was in the 19th century, it still is today. The Geneva Academy just recently released guidelines for investigation on IHL violations, which is also a way to go beyond the maybe current stalemate in terms of multilateral negotiations. So I think this is really important also to keep in mind that what's in academia ultimately can be very concrete in the battlefield.
Thank you.
A question perhaps.
Question in the back.
And then this and afterwards, but go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. A question perhaps to Boyd, but also to other panelists if they so wish. I'm interested in your historical perspectives on the role and influence of non-state actors in particular. We've discussed we've discussed academia, so media and civil society, NGOs beyond the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, in shaping popular perception of the Geneva Conventions, and also in perhaps in this part to Jean-Marie in contributing in one way or another to the commentaries. So over time.
Yes. I think it connects to a question that was previously asked about dissemination. So there are many different, what we now call NGOs, that have been involved in the promotion of IHL throughout, let's say, the period after 49. We have the International Commission of Jurists, whose representative is apparently here, who have played a critical role in shaping IHL, roughly from the 1670s onwards. They kind of set the whole process of the protocols imagining in motion. I'm sure that people at ICRC may have a different opinion about this, but I think the Commission of Jurists as well as the UN were really critical in setting that process into motion, without trying to say that the ICRC didn't do all kinds of things in the preceding decade to reimagine the conventions. And I can think of many other ones, and I can also talk about the role of national liberation movements in the 60s and 70s, trying to engage with international humanitarian law that is quite transformative, at least in the perception that IHL is not just for Europeans or for North Americans. It's in a way a universal tool that could be used by anyone. So in more recent work, I've also been trying to look at how national liberation movements actually in the 1940s, so not in the 60s and 70s, which is kind of a familiar story, but also in the 1940s dealt with the convention before they were signed. Because, of course, we had conventions before 1949, and to what extent that had an impact on the laws making. And what it strikes people or groups, anti-colonial groups in Indonesia as well as Vietnam, actively engaged with the conventions, and they saw the conventions as a critical tool to elevate their international status. So they wanted to become part of the family of nations, and one way of doing that is to use the conventions and invoke them, and show them that they're also dealing more humanely with their prisoners than their enemy. And I think that's a kind of a mechanism, of course, that NGOs now or the ICRC also deal with or try to use in order to put pressure on armed groups. And maybe you're not doing it for yourself or not for the individual, him or herself who's in prison, but do it for your status, or do it for your reputation, or try to show that you are doing it better than your enemy. So these kind of mechanisms, of course, are kind of timeless. They are still used by organizations like the ICRC to put pressure on different groups, state or non-state, to promote the conventions or comply with them in meaningful ways. I think the last thing I want to say is that the question of dissemination and younger people, I think that's a question that's also been addressed before, is not a new one. It's not that just came up recently. I think from the very moment the conventions were signed, people at the ICRC, whose names have already been mentioned, were thinking about how to make this body of law relevant to everyone, including even children. So if you would go into the archives, and Jean-Marie has also been there, you would see all these kind of cartoons about how to disseminate the conventions among the youngest. But also you have all these kind of toys that very senior men, even officers, were using, I think also in some other places, to show how you can apply the convention. What can you do, can you not do kind of simulations. So there are a whole range of different ways of disseminating conventions beyond the ICRC, beyond the commentary, and it could go on for a long time. These are just a few examples.
Thank you. Do you want to add something?
No, that's fine.
Then we have one last question in the back.
Thank you. Thank you for the insightful contributions from the panelists. The question is related to the subsequent practice, especially in the context of your Common Article 3 updation. Regarding the subsequent practice, I'm just wondering, how did you collect the information relating to subsequent practice of states when it comes to developing countries, especially they are reticent when it comes to implementing the IHL treaties are concerned. If especially developing countries, their opinions are not reflected, how reliable the commentary that you are updating will be cited as a reliable document? Thank you.
Yes, no, that's a very good question, and obviously the Geneva Conventions are universally ratified, so, and we need to also in the research be sure that we are covering the whole world and all countries, and that we do not privilege certain practices over others. So we are looking at all the things that we can find, but practice translates itself in declarations, translates itself in military manuals and other aspects of practice, and also jurisprudence, as I said, case law. So these are the things we are reflecting, and also through the peer reviewers, which are coming from all over the world, including now for GC3, obviously countries that had conflict in the past, that were involved with prisoners of war. So India, Pakistan. For GC1 we had also peer reviewers from Sri Lanka. We've had from Malaysia, Indonesia. So it is really from all over the world, and it is quite extensive. And we encourage them also to point to us practices that have been missing. Of course, to be sure that we are as representative as possible, so that the Geneva Conventions, being universal, the commentary also can be as universally acceptable as possible. But as I said, we also reflect diverging views, of course, where we know that the interpretations are not shared. Now, with the denial of existence of armed conflict and the denial of the application of IHL, we do not go into individual cases. A commentary is not a tool to comment on current events. I mean, it doesn't comment on what's happening in Yemen or Syria. It gives some examples from the past, like Eritrea, Ethiopia, because there was a claims commission, as has been mentioned, which has issued awards, and these are like legal awards that give interpretations on practice. For the denial of the application of IHL, I would just like to say one thing is we have a section on discussing on who classifies conflicts. It's something Professor Sassoli also mentioned. We have no central authority in the world classifying. States can classify, states can say there is an armed conflict or there is no armed conflict. The ICRC can do so and has to do so to be able to carry out its work. And then the UN can also do so, and in many cases also the Security Council, by calling upon parties to a particular conflict to respect IHL, it thereby classifies the situation as an armed conflict. But the big novelty of the 1949 Geneva Conventions was that the classification of conflicts should be based on the facts. So both for non-international armed conflict, there are a number of indicators and that were also further developed by the ICTY and the ICTR to be able to determine are we in the face of a non-international conflict or not, and also for international conflict. So before it was based on declaration of war and statements by states and maybe the intention. Now it is based on the facts, and it is solely based on the facts. Then of course on the facts, reasonable minds can disagree. But so that's the situation, let's say, with regard to recognizing whether there is a non-international conflict or not in a state, and trying to be as representative as possible in reflecting practices from around the world. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Do you, each of you, want to say one last word? Then I think that this was a very, very rich discussion. Thank you very much on the behalf of the Geneva Academy for bearing with us through it. And what I've taken from today's event is that if we want to celebrate the Geneva Conventions properly, maybe the best way of doing so is putting them back in their rightful context. So historical context, and remembering that it's not only a retroactive instrument, also in the context of general public international law, and remembering that as specialized we have become in this institution is, the convention interact with another very various different wide set of rules that Jean-Marie, for instance, mentioned, and that of course they have to be put back in the context of where they are supposed to be applied, which is in situations of armed conflict. On that note, thank you very much for being with us, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.